So this talk is part of the Social Justice Center Fellows Lunchtime seminars, but I apologize for not being able to serve food. I hope to be able to be allowed to serve food at the next event, which will be Leah's talk on May 20. The Social Justice Center at Concordia University is directed by Bengi Akbulut, who will join us in a couple of minutes. She's a professor at the Department of Geography, Planning, and the Environment. And first, before we start, we would like to remind ourselves that our activities are taking place on Indigenous lands. As researchers in social justice, our mandate is, of course, to encourage and support social justice research. So we are committed to encouraging people to learn about Indigenous issues and to support Indigenous struggles for self-determination and the protection of nature, and also to actively resist colonialism and neo-colonialism. So today we will hear Balam Nedim Kenta, I hope I said it okay, who is PhD student at Concordia University Centers for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture, and also graduate fellow at the Social Justice Center. So bridging political philosophy, critical disability studies, and critical animal studies, Balam's dissertation work focuses on the historical and material entanglements of ableism and anthropocentrism under late capitalism. The talk will be followed by a comment by Jessie Arseneault, who teaches at the Department of English at Concordia University. His research is situated in the field of African cultural studies and deals with representation of the human-animal dichotomy in African cultural texts. His work deals with post-colonial theory, animal studies, queer theory, South African student protest, and critical race studies. He's interested in how African texts can both resist the dehumanization of Africans, but in such a way that stresses the shared lives of human and non-human, and his work is an attempt to resist anthropocentric logics that equate animality with subhumanity. He is also co-director of SPAM, the Society, Politics, Animals, and Materialities Center. So we will start with Balam's talk and then to Jessie's comment, and we will end the session with a period for question and discussion. Thank you all for being here, and it's your turn, Balam.
Thank you, Christiane, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you and Bengi so much for organizing this, and the Social Justice Center for supporting us and giving us this opportunity to share our research. And thank you so much, Jessie, for coming here for this. I really appreciate it. So before I begin talking about what I'm going to talk about today, I wanted to give you a general idea of my... Christiane? I can't hear you.
We forgot to share your slides and text in the chat.
Oh, I can do that now.
Can you that? Yeah, I think people will like to follow with the text.
Yes, I'm basically just reading. I have zero spontaneity, so I do not have thoughts. I'm just trying to find Zoom again.
Would you like me to do that while you speak?
Yeah, why don't you send that through, because I did something with the...
Of course, no problem.
I'm still screen sharing, yes?
Yes, everything is going great.
Okay. But I think I'm out of the slideshow thing.
Oh, you just have to play the first one, play from start. At the left.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to give you a general idea of my research, but Christiane already did that. In its most general outlines, my dissertation project aims to build the groundwork for a new paradigm of domination, which takes seriously and is informed by the intersections of anthropocentrism and ableism under late capitalism. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. So animals and disabled people are rarely engaged in political and philosophical work on exploitation, oppression, and capitalism. They're marginalized in these discourses as afterthoughts, or they're used as counterexamples and marginal cases to prop up the paradigm cases, which feature non-disabled humans. And animals and disabled people haunt such texts as symbols and metaphors, which again serve to illuminate non-disabled and or human concerns rather than their concerns. And of course, this has been changing, but then it's given away to another phenomenon where there's a problematic mediation of animals and disabled people, where there's theoretical work done in the name of one, the other is sort of called up as evoked as a principle of intelligibility or for the former, which I call the problem of analogy. And one of the ways my project tries to deal with this and circumvent this is to remain on the level of systemic oppression and exploitation, and to suggest that systems of oppression such as anthropocentrism, ableism, and capitalism are historically, materially, and discursively interacting with each other. They co-evolve and inform one another. And at their intersections, certain beings become mutually addressable, although they're not necessarily ontologically analogizable. And in order to do that, the theoretical sort of foundation is to combine Foucault and Marx's analyses of power. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm limiting the discussion to a very preliminary fleshing out of the convergences between Marx and Foucault. And this comes from my comprehensive exam work. So they're not really full-fledged arguments, but theoretical hunches and intuitions that still need quite a bit of work. So I plan to broadly examine the methodological convergence between Marx and Foucault, and I suggest that it's genealogy. I'm going to suggest that they're both genealogists of capitalism. In terms of the theoretical convergence, I think it revolves around biopolitics, production, and relation, although in this talk, I'm only going to talk about biopolitics and capitalism and bracket out relation for concerns of time. In terms of biopolitics, I look at disability and animality as apparatuses, which are both managed through the biopolitics of superfluity and enclosure. In terms of production, I suggest that both Foucault and Marx are thinkers of a productive power, whereby capitalism emerges as a system that disables and animalizes, in that it produces certain bodies and subjectivities, both human and non-human, through discourses and practices of speciation and capacitation. And since I'm looking at anthropocentrism and processes of capacitation and debilitation in relation to capitalism, I'm interested in constructing maybe genealogies of these things. And I wonder if we can use insights from Foucault and Marx in order to do that. So the first question for the paper was, are Marx and Foucault genealogists of capitalism? And of course, what is genealogy? Because we don't really get a very systematic kind of methodological explanation anywhere in Foucault's writings. But they're sort of like little definitions sprinkled here and there, sometimes in his interviews. So I'm going to try to construct something from secondary resources and from Foucault. So according to Andreas Sartori, at the core of genealogy is a critique of origins, or a critique of search for origins. Sartori is basing this on Foucault's article called Nietzsche, Genealogy and History, where Foucault says, search for origins is a futile attempt to capture the exact essence of things. So it's essentialistic at first. And it's a search that assumes the image of a primordial truth hiding behind forms of appearance. And instead, Foucault says, behind the flux of history are not essences, not timeless and essential secrets, but the secret that maybe they have no essence, or that the essence was fabricated in a piecemeal fashion from alien forms. And similarly, Mike Poster says that Foucault was a historian of discontinuity. Instead of giving support to the present, which is the status quo, by tracing a line of inevitability through which the meanings of the past are sort of reconciled in the present, the genealogist breaks off that continuity between the past and the present, making the past foreign and strange, and undercutting the legitimacy of the present. So the critique of a search of origins and discontinuity are related. They're sort of the same thing in the sense that a search for origins would also imply a continuity from that origin. And here is Foucault giving us the closest full definition of a genealogy that I could find. This is from a lecture in 1976. So Foucault says, let us give the term genealogy to the union of erudite knowledge and local memories, which allows us to establish a historical knowledge of struggles and to make use of this knowledge tactically today. And what it really does, what genealogy does, is to entertain the claims to attention of local, discontinuous, disqualified, illegitimate knowledges against the claims of a unitary body of theory, which would filter, hierarchize, and order them in the name of some true knowledge or true science. So genealogies are not positivistic returns to an exact science, they are anti-sciences. So this quote brings together the former features, but also gives an idea of why genealogy might be used as a methodology in the first place. What is the political project of genealogy as critique? So if we look at, Marx from the Communist Manifesto and Engels, where they're like, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. That doesn't sound genealogical. It sounds very teleological and super Hegelian. But I think we find a different approach in other writings like Capital, where Marx begins with commodities instead of, the history of class struggle or something like that. And I think it's a very interesting beginning. It shows how the simple commodity has these various beginnings in accident and at the margins of communities. So in this point at the analysis, Marx is slowly unfurling his theory of value from these unassuming premises: a simple equation, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, and 2 simple commodities. And here, humans are at the margins. There's no historical subject to speak of. So before extracting some kind of general law or the capitalist society, the form of capitalist society from them, Marx proceeds, I think, genealogically, while he's demystifying the value relationship and the magic of money, which turns out to be nothing but a particular kind of commodity, which in time, in fits and starts, comes to acquire, first exceptionally, then habitually, a specific social function. And before crystallizing into the money form, the universal equivalent form of the money, the equivalent form of the commodity, which is a commodity that can be exchanged for every other commodity, I'm quoting from Marx here, comes and goes with the momentary social contacts which call it into existence. It is transiently attached to this or that commodity in alternation. The particular kind of commodity to which it sticks is first a matter of accident. So it can be cattle, it can be something else, and it changes with the social and historical context. And commodity exchange not only starts sporadically and by accident, but also it's a border phenomenon. It happens at the points where communities have their boundaries and their points of contacts with other communities. And similarly, trading nations, properly so-called, exist only in the interstices of the ancient world, like gods of Epicurus in the intermundia. And intermundia are spaces between different worlds. So on its way from various intermundia of insignificance to the center, taking its money form in gold and later replacing itself with the symbols like paper money, the money commodity obscures its own traces, leading some to think it has imaginary value or that it's arbitrary or it's a symbol, which then necessitates a genealogy of the process of how it came to be this way. And the mediations that it goes through are so numerous that they begin to obscure their trajectory, but not their origin, because there is none. It's already multiple origins here. And then Marx does this work to understand their present function and do some historical work to demystify. So Andrew Sartori calls this what Marx is doing, radical historicization or genealogy. I'm not going to read this quote. I just put it out there so that there's at least one more person who thinks Marx is a genealogist, and I don't live in a world of fantasy. So while Marx might be a genealogist, on the other hand, I think Foucault is much more systematic than just, an anti-historian and, a discontinuous person, although he had aversion to a unitary body of theory and prefer to focus on the capillary of power, his research does pertain to how capillary power, how minutiae of techniques and processes that begin with some need or other assume a more global character in time. So Foucault explains the process of this generalization with regards to the genealogy of madness with the following words. The mechanism of the exclusion of madness began from a particular point in time, and for reasons which need to be studied to reveal their political usefulness and to lend themselves to economic profit, and that as a natural consequence, all of a sudden, they came to be colonized and maintained by global mechanisms and the entire state system. It is only if we grasp these techniques of power and demonstrate the economic advantages or political utility that derives from them in a given context for specific reasons that we can understand how these mechanisms come to be effectively incorporated into the social whole. And similar treatment of disciplinarization as a multiple phenomenon, a process that had many origins, and then finally, little by little, was arranged in a bundle, which, to use Marxist terminology, crystallized into various normalization procedures that can be abstracted, transferred, and applied in a wide range of domains, like hospitals, asylums, and prisons. So my point here is that I find their technique very similar in the sense that they're both kind of historical materialists. They begin with a practice and they extract certain concepts and apparatuses from these practices, and then they use those concepts to, again, understand that practice better. So we already know Foucault's technique is genealogy, but it remains to be shown if Foucault can also be, characterized as a genealogist of capitalism. And again, there's at least one more person who says this. So Roberto Negro says that Foucault, in his own way, examines the genealogy of capitalism in the sense that he examines what one finds beneath the production process, institutions and practices that are situated below the threshold of expressivity or the substratum of capitalism. So Foucault's subject matter is not capitalism per se, but most of the phenomena that he looks at are from 19th century at the advent of capitalism. And these institutions are part of the operating conditions of industrial capitalist society. So this is, again, a long quote. I'm just going to paraphrase it really fast. So Negro suggests that if Marx studied the processes that made capital accumulation possible, then Foucault studied the means of accumulation of human beings, and that these are not separable. They sort of make each other possible and necessary and serve as a model for one another. So now, sort of trying to get back to my own project, since my general project is concerned with looking at capitalism as a system that disables and animalizes, I'm interested in constructing genealogies of capitalism that centrally thematize animals and disabled people in them. And this part of the project is concerned with at least two kinds of disablement and animalization. So there's the more Foucaultian inflected pole, where we will be concerned with the production of bodies, but also subjectivation as disabled and animal. So in terms of disability, would be interested in the advent of a category of disability that developed along with and in relation to the development of capitalism. And we see some of this work in critical disability studies today. In terms of animals, we could look at how the category of livestock has developed around the time of enclosures, that Hribal does, and I'm going to get into it in a little bit. We could also look at the progression of animal biopolitics in the animal industrial complex that Dinesh Wadwell looks at, and I'm going to look at that also in a little bit. And we can also do a Foucaultian study for disability. For instance, Sticker's History of Disability closely tracks Foucault's genealogy of madness, but focuses on physical disability, which was excluded by Foucault. And on the more Marxian inflected fall, we could look at the relationship of disabled people and animals to labor and production, neither of them being part of the working class in an obvious way. In terms of animals, Wadwell, Hribal, and Shuken's Animal Capital are instructive in this manner. And in terms of connecting disability and capitalism, there are also some instructive works that I indicated here. And some of the scholars who can give us insights into how to construct these genealogies work with Foucault and Marx, luckily. But my project necessitates a genealogy that takes animality and disability in tandem. So like how to sort of imagine them at the same time and how they relate to each other. And one connection that I've been able to make that sort of brings these threads together has been a joint study of the rendering industry alongside with surplus populations, which I argue are both managed through a capitalist biopolitics of waste management, which is itself a driver of profit maximization and extraction. So now I want to try to construct apparatuses of disability and animality and connect them to capitalism. And I'm first going to look at Sonora Taylor's book. It's a wonderful book called Beast of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation. It's one of the few and first works that look at both of these systems together. And I want to look at the title a little bit because it seems to play on an interesting tension, which is relevant here. So beasts of burden, burden may refer to both non-human animals' labor, their exploitation, and also to the common ableist trope of non-laboring disabled people as burdens to society, thus marking their non-exploitation. This is not a tension that Taylor explicitly addresses, but I'm sort of pulling it out to help us think through these ideas of exploitation and oppression. So Taylor's book, to very unjustly simplify it in a line, is saying that animal liberation and disability liberation should be united because the oppression of animals and disabled people, as well as the discourses used to justify such oppression, are historically and philosophically entangled. And here's a quote from Taylor that illustrates that. So Taylor says, justifications for human domination over animals almost always rely on comparing human and animal abilities and traits. We humans are the species with language, with rationality, with complex emotions, with 2 legs and opposable thumbs. Animals lack these traits and abilities and therefore exist outside of our moral responsibility, which means we can dominate and use them. And in another passage, Taylor tells us that anthropocentrism is something that informs ableism and says, those humans who have been associated with animals, people of color, women, queer people, poor people, and disabled people, among others, are also seen as less sophisticated, as having less value, and sometimes even as being less or non-human. In fact, certain abilities and capacities are central to definitions of the human. They're thought to mark the boundaries between humanity and the rest of the animal world. So to rephrase Taylor's in a more Foucaultian inflection, we can say that anthropocentrism emerges as a discourse of ableism and ableism as a discourse of speciation. But this setup seems to prioritize ableism as a model for anthropocentrism, since anthropocentrism seems to be defined as a form of ableism, which depends on demarcating certain capacities as the divider. And this is a very famous quote from Kerry Wolf, seems to do the opposite. So Kerry Wolf says, the discourse of animality has historically served as a critical strategy in the oppression of humans by other humans, a strategy whose legitimacy and force depend, however, on the prior taking for granted of the traditional ontological distinction and the consequent ethical divide between human and non-human animals. So in Wolf's setup, anthropocentrism serves as a model for all manners of interhuman oppression, making all other oppressions different genres of speciation dependent on an originary ontological human-animal divide. So this is a question of primacy. This is sort of not very genealogical. It's kind of originary. It tries to pin down an originary oppression. But maybe we can circumvent this with a Foucaultian and Marxian genealogical method as a methodology of discontinuity. And in this model, maybe we can say that anthropocentrism and ableism might have both had multiple origins, with techniques of subjectivation and subjection developed in each, intersecting and diverging until becoming consolidated into global mechanisms that confront us as distinct form of domination, or in the case of animals and the disabled, as a Mobius strip of exploitation and exploitation, as systems of domination and circuits of exploitation that interact, intersect, and support each other without necessarily coinciding. So it seems to me that Foucault and Marx are both necessary to capture the entirety of that movement, from the most minute exercise of power in its capillary formations to the most systematic crystallizations thereof. And it also seems that these concerns intersect at the point of biopolitics, which can encompass animal and human life alike, and bring Foucault and Marx together over a biopolitics of capitalism that produces, reproduces, and manages animal and disabled bodies for maximum utility and governability, variously investing in valorizing and otherwise consuming and disposing of them. So if biopolitics is the management of life at the level of populations, as Foucault tells us, whereby the set of mechanisms through which the basic biological features of the human species became the object of a political strategy, of a general strategy of power, it then encompasses both the disciplines of the body and regulation of populations, which makes biopower, according to Foucault, an indispensable element in the development of capitalism. And if biopolitics is founded on the biological fact of humans as a species, then as a discourse of speciation and embodiment, it seems like it's well suited to study both animality and disability. But what would it mean to approach animality and disability as apparatuses without losing track of a biopolitical capitalism that situates them at the poles of exploitation, non-exploitation, utility, disutility, while at the same time excluding them both from the notion of labor? For disability, we have a preliminary model in Shelley Tremaine, who is a Foucaultian disability scholar, and argues that the apparatus of disability has been integral and vital to the strategies of biopower, which operate through apparatuses of normalization. And operating within a positive configuration of power, which produces the objects of its own inquiry, Tremaine defines disability as an apparatus of force relations, a product of human invention and intervention all the way down. So Tremaine distances themselves from conceptions of disability that take it as a self-evident or natural state of deficiency. But Tremaine also distances themselves from social models of disability, which regard disablement as a social construct founded in a prior naturalized state of impairment, which only becomes disablement when it encounters ableist oppression. So I'm going through this really fast, but I'm going to open it up in the discussion because there is more to say about that. But I really like this concise definition from Tremaine that takes disability as an apparatus. And I'd like to read it together with you. So Tremaine says, to understand disability as an apparatus is to conceive of it as a far-reaching and systemic matrix of power that contributes to, is inseparable from, and reinforces other apparatuses of historical force relations. On this understanding, disability is not a metaphysical substrate, a natural biological category, or a characteristic that only certain individuals embody or possess, but rather is a historically contingent network of force relations in which everyone is implicated and entangled, and in relation to which everyone occupies a position. That is, to be disabled or non-disabled is to occupy a certain subject position within the productive constraints of the apparatus of disability. So it seems that this approach to disability might solve our primacy problem, while also retaining a complicated entanglement with other apparatuses of force relations. But this conception of disability also completely excludes the possibility of disability as a form of oppression, because Tremaine is interested in moving disability away from restrictive conceptualizations of it as a personal characteristic or attributes, a property given individuals, an identity, a difference, or a form of social oppression. So how could we move in this framework within the context of a study that seeks to contextualize disability as an apparatus in relation to capitalism? One path would be to take capitalism as a form of biopower, as a dynamic conglomeration of myriad apparatuses, which converge to produce particular effects of power, which then consolidate into something that looks like a system. But as another example, this is another disability scholar at the other end, who's expressing one of the clearest instances of positioning disability within an oppressive, exploitative, capitalist matrix. And Russell says, we take the view that disability is a socially created category derived from labor relations, a product of the exploitative economic structure of capitalist society, one which creates and then oppresses the so-called disabled body as one of the conditions that allow the capitalist class to accumulate wealth. Seen in the slide, disability is an aspect of the central contradiction of capitalism. The primary oppression of disabled persons is their exclusion from exploitation as wage laborers. So one of the most dominant understandings of disability in the West is based on, kind of nominally based on a Marxist model, because the advocates of this model rarely engage with capitalism or Marx on a very meaningful level. But Russell is one of the few exceptions. And so here's, Russell looking at capitalism and disability as an oppression, and here's Tremaine coming from a Foucaultian angle and not really engaging capitalism or oppression or exploitation at all. But I don't think they're as far from each other as they seem, because soon after this proclamation that situates disability as a product of labor relations, Russell notes that this exclusion results in disabled people coming to be regarded as a social problem. So that's Foucaultian language right there. And justification emerged for segregating them out of mainstream life. And Russell talks about the medicalization of disablement and disability as an important boundary category. So we're right back into biopolitics here. So I don't think they're that different, and maybe they can work together. So now I want to turn to animality as an apparatus, but this is a more difficult task because we're not treated to a book length study as Tremaine. So I repurposed Tremaine's definition and to see if that could work as an apparatus for us. So to understand animality as an apparatus is to conceive of it as a far-reaching and systemic matrix of power that contributes to, is inseparable from, and reinforces other apparatuses of historical force relations. On this understanding, animality is not a metaphysical substrate, a natural biological category, or a characteristic that only certain beings embody or possess, but rather is a historically contingent network of force relations in which everyone, human and non-human, is implicated and entangled, and in relation to which everyone, human and non-human, occupies a position. That is, to be animal or human is to occupy a certain subject position within the productive constraints of the apparatus of animality. So this is a very crude exercise, but we can see how the two apparatuses may intersect and inform one another if we were to construct a similar apparatus for animality, and how they may have developed contingently and historically, how they may have crossed paths along the way, and how beings who are not necessarily animal under any definition might be implicated in this apparatus and occupy a subject position within it, like how disabled people are compared to animals, or how animals are defined as deficient versions of presumably non-disabled humans as a power effect of this apparatus. But turning the definition like this to animality might risk making animality an apparatus that only concerns humans. How are we to account for the subjectification of animals and not only their subjection, which seems to come naturally to us? So another way to phrase this concern is whether biopower and biopolitics can be applied to a consideration of animals, because it seems to be reliant on subjectification, and maybe it presupposes a level of sentience, not only to respond, but resist. So in this regard, I turn to Dinesh Waddiwell's work, which gives us a resounding answer in the affirmative for this in terms of using biopolitics and looking at animals. Because Waddiwell suggests that technologies of animal slaughter already implicitly rely on agency and subjectivity of animals and exploit them. And on animal intersubjectivity and co-productivity. These kinds of manufacturing devices and technologies proceed from an understanding of the animal as a subject whose sentient engagement with the world can be recruited to assist production by manipulating the environment. And also Waddiwell's biopolitical consideration is clearly situated within a capitalist field of force relations, and talks about how every ounce of creativity of animals is exploited right down to the metabolic and generative capacities, and the biopolitics of both large-scale killing and large-scale breeding comes into the picture. So at this point, with the help of Tremaine and Waddiwell, we've sketched how animality as an apparatus may work within a capitalist biopolitics. And Waddiwell works with a simultaneously Foucaultian and Marxian framework, which is production focused. And there's another scholar, Hribal, who comes from a labor perspective and situates animals within the working class through a labor focus, and says that animals do not naturally become private property, no more than humans naturally come to sell their labor. Rather, there's an active history here, one of expropriation, exploitation, and resistance. So then Hribal proceeds to tell the history of how unwaged animal labor from the time of enclosures, which went hand in hand with increasingly biopolitical measures to breed, shape, and discipline animals for more productivity, has played an essential role in the development of capitalism. And Hribal also notes a discursive shift from flesh as a rare food to the mass-produced and mass-consumed meat, which also marks a shift in relations between animals and humans, as well as the different mode of production. So Hribal is kind of a marginalized voice in animal studies because labor doesn't sit well with people even when they attribute sentience to animals. And this is a problem that Nicole Shukin also addresses in their book Animal Capital, and says that the figure of labor as an exclusively human phenomenon has dominated all manners of critiques of capitalism, including biopolitical ones, to the exclusion of the material history of the subsumption of non-human nature, animal labor, animal bodies, and production into capital. And Marxist critiques of capitalism also feature narrow definitions of labor, which exclude many forms of human labor, like reproductive, unwaged, informal, illegal, and non-capital producing, as well as non-human labor. And in terms of this study, the conflation of human with labor would not only deny non-human labor, but would also signal the exclusion of the non-laborer, like disabled people, from the category of human. So there's a lot at stake in terms of how we situate these things in labor. So we have a preliminary idea of a Marxist Foucaultian biopolitics, which now circulates with these apparatuses of animality and disability. How are we going to put them in a relationship with capitalism specifically? So one solution is a production-centered approach like Waddell's, who looks at production and extraction of value, as well as the production of subjectivation from non-labor in the case of animals. And another possibly concomitant approach is to direct our attention to one of the most important contradictions of capitalism that Marx explores in chapter 25 of Capital, where he's looking at surplus populations. And this is where I think we see the dependence of capitalism on the production of surplus populations who are redundant to capital, that is, the dependence of capitalism on non-labor. So such populations, which Marx calls the hospital of the active labor army, are then managed through a biopolitics of superfluity and enclosure, which further extracts value out of them. While the figure of both labor and non-labor is human in Marx, as we've already touched upon in Animal Capital, Shukin presents an alternative genealogy of capitalism, where the disassembly of animal bodies and the traffic in animal substances feature heavily in making possible the reproduction of capitalist hegemony, and where the social bios is materially contingent upon and continuous with the lives of non-human others. So the figure of non-labor can also encompass animals within capitalism, and this becomes a productive place to study both the apparatus of disability and animality, accumulation and management of human and non-human bodies, which form two invisibilized motors of capitalist accumulation. So according to what Marx calls the absolute general law of capital accumulation, as capital grows, so does the working class, and so does a portion of the working class, which is redundant to capital. So surplus population is not just a necessary product of accumulation or development of capitalist wealth, but such a population is at the same time the lever of capitalistic accumulation and the very condition of the existence of the capitalist mode of production. And Capital section on surplus population is also one of the few places where we find Marx engaging with disability, although not in so many words because the concept wasn't quite there. But we see disability evoked as part of the stagnant portion of superfluity, which is the hardest to be absorbed by capital as labor. Today, at least 40% of the global workforce is rendered superfluous. And this is from 2014. I think this is a much bigger number now after the COVID crisis. Most of this global surplus population is also disabled, about 60% actually. So showing capitalism to be a disabling power and a producer of disability quite literally. And so we've also seen the above sections that disability emerges as an apparatus subject to biopolitical control at the advent of capitalism. So for Marx, in terms of animals, they're products of labor for him, as well as instruments of labor or raw material. But interestingly, they're not products of nature, but the result of a gradual transformation continued through many generations under human control and through the agency of human labor. So Marx does not even entertain the notions that animals are living beings, but in the same move, he also inadvertently acknowledges the historicity of the biopolitics of animal breeding in relation to capital production. So there's a little history there that flashes. And as Foucault states, animals do not become commodities by nature, but through a history, and they're made livestock through a process of biopower through the development of capitalism. So, and interestingly, again, there's a little flash. With regards to surplus populations, Marx makes a comment that refers back to this biopolitical practice. So in some sense, indicating an animalizing effect of superfluity. And he says, surplus population forms a disposable industrial reserve army, which belongs to capital just as absolutely as if the latter had bred it at its own cost. So Schukin's study on rendering challenges anthropocentric approaches to the critique of capitalism. As with animal capital, that involves the non-labor-centric extraction of value from animal death, late capitalism, in its intensifying recapitalization and colonization of its internal resources, engages with a similar non-labor-centric exploitation of human superfluity. Just as the enormous waste of animal death becomes a problem of absorption by nature, providing rationale for the rendering industry, the growing number of people becoming unexploitable and therefore redundant becomes a problem of absorption for capital, providing rationale for spatial and institutional control. The proliferation of spaces of exception like ghettos, slums, refugee camps, hospitals, and prisons for surplus populations echoes animal spaces of exception like zoos, agro-industrial farms, and scientific labs. According to Hudson, who's a radical geographer, urban space at the advent of industrial capitalism was structured around the double invisibilization of human poverty and animal suffering. And I quote from Hudson, whether through segregating the working poor in ghettos and manufacturing districts, or by locating slaughterhouses away from city centers. So both of these processes of dealing with the problem of absorption and these spaces of exception become ways of extracting profit and capital out of non-labor and non-productivity. Hudson further notes that the non-human animal occupies a liminal space at once within and outside the sphere of production, never allowed to be an active participant in the system, though determined by it, which is a position increasingly occupied by more than 1 billion humans excluded from labor and production. So just as the logic of recycling embodied by rendering in Schukin's study does not offer a redemptive or subversive challenge to capitalist hegemony, but rather supplements the sustainability of capitalism, the critique of capitalism from the standpoint of labor might reinforce and affirm the production process of capitalism, according to Hudson. The phenomenon of surplus populations has intensified along with the exacerbation of animal domination ever since the violent institution of capitalism through enclosures and primitive accumulation, uprooting and sequestering animal and human bodies alike. Enclosures, however, did not merely free workers from land, they were also the beginning of artificial conditions under which animals lived in an ever amplified form since then. And I'm quoting from Hudson here again, contemporary factory farming intensifies animal enclosure, removing livestock from their outdoor enclosures to barren, crowded stalls and factory conditions. Here animals cease to represent domesticated nature, becoming instead representatives of an industrial production process that reduces all life to bare life. So to conclude, capitalism emerges not only as a negative, but as a positive formation of power relations, which produces certain beings as animals and disabled. Further, these apparatuses intersect. As animals are manufactured to be disabled and or are inadvertently disabled through the horrendous conditions of the industry, labor is similarly manufactured to be redundant. While most of the redundant are disabled, it is also the case that poverty, lack of access to nutritious food and clean water, lack of access to adequate healthcare, living in hazardous environments is also a source of disablement. Surplus populations in relation with the apparatus of disability and enclosures in relation to the apparatus of animality are possible points of inquiry that can prove fruitful in investigating Foucault and Marx as thinkers of a productive power within the context of capitalism. While Marx questions surplus populations from working class proper, and Foucault's main subject matter seem to be surplus populations, in some sense, they both regard them as historical apparatuses produced by capitalism and as supplements of capitalism at once. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Balam. So now we can stop sharing your screen.
Yes.
I have two screens, I'm all mixed up. Okay, so now I will pin Jessie, so we'll see. Pin. Okay, so now we see you, Jessie. So you can use at least like 15 minutes. It's okay, we have the time.
Okay. Well, first of all, yeah, I just want to extend a huge, gratefulness for having me here, both to Christian and to Balam. I'm really delighted to be here, especially to discuss with the Social Justice Center that's been on my radar for a while, but I haven't really been involved with. But also, especially to Balam, for having been in conversation for quite some time about the kind of work that you're doing. In an earlier draft of this paper, I was reading the way that you were thinking about relation, and I know you started this presentation. You didn't address that in this presentation specifically, but I was thinking about relation and thinking about potential responses and questions I could ask you today. And I am going to ask a few questions because I do want to hear you speak more. So I'm not just going to speak for a full 15 minutes. But thinking on relation, both in the way that you're discussing it, but also on a more kind of imminent and intimate level, and sort of emphasize that, the questions and comments that I'm offering here are really offered in gratefulness to you for sharing your work with me for so long and for bringing me into relation to this work, because I feel like most, if not everything that I've come to learn about disability studies over the last few years has been because of coming into contact with your work. So I'm really super grateful to be able to converse with you today. So I have kind of broad questions about how you're thinking about relation, and I know, so you don't have to answer this question specifically, because I know you said at the beginning that you weren't addressing it in this presentation, but there's a really compelling kind of model of relationality that you've got working through this presentation, in the sense that, sometimes when I hear relation spoken about, especially in certain strands of animal studies or post-human thinking, it's often kind of opposed to more structural questions that you're getting at here, as if relationality happens on a kind of interpersonal or intersubjective level, and structure is this thing that we're dominated by and live under. And yet, when I see you kind of thinking about capitalism, ableism, and anthropocentrism together, there's a real sense of, I think the way you put it in your paper, how these systems work at the level of kind of capillary formations, all the way to the level of systematic crystallizations. So there's a really compelling kind of way of speaking about relationality here. So actually, maybe I'll start with that question. I have a follow-up, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how ideas about relation have informed your project. Yeah, let's start there.
Yeah. It's one of the things is that I'm trying to understand everything. I'm trying to sort of build some kind of model that can respond to both that interpersonal and intimate relation and the capillary, and also like all these systems that come to confront us that seem so kind of like intractable at the same time. So I'm trying to sort of have a balance. But the relation that I took out of the presentation for time purposes in this particular thing was that you see Marx doing a lot with relation. So because he's like very dialectical, and he's operating on processual kind of not substance, but process ontology and things are always in motion. And so he doesn't really define kind of like ontological categories, but like certain fluxes and relationships. And he doesn't, so I think one of the reasons we're misunderstanding some of this work is because we are looking at them with like our own kind of like categories, whereas they're all in motion. Like class is not some kind of category, but it's actually a relation. It's actually a process of proletarianization and surplusization and blah, blah. So in that sense, relation for me puts things in motion and makes them sort of like political and processional rather than like these fixed entities. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, so like Foucault's relationship to Marx is really complicated. It's kind of like Marx's relationship to Hegel. Sort of like we're kind of doing the same thing, but I'm inverting it. So like it's a very weird relationship. I put an extra slide, which I didn't use, where Foucault is like, I always quote Marx, but I don't use quotation marks because I don't want people to think, you know, I'm a Marxist. So he's actually putting a distance between him and like the Marxist tradition, but not necessarily Marx. And he's like, you know, do you quote Einstein when you're talking about physics? Like, and he's like, you know, I sort of situate my work in the general horizon. Can you even be a historian without being Marxist and so on? But one of the critiques that Foucault raises is that, you know, oh, Marx is only looking at production relations, but what really matters, what we need to look at are power relations. So Marx doesn't necessarily talk about power, but I think they're compatible in that sense as well. And of course, Marx is not only looking at production relations, he's looking at a lot of things and how they relate to each other. So that's kind of an unfair criticism, but it does come out as one of the most important kind of forms in the way that capitalism works. So yes, it is important, but it's not the only important thing, and you can't understand it without other relations and other processes. But there was this quote that I found in Marx's footnotes are so funny and amazing if you read Capital. And one of the quotes that he has, let me see if I can pull it up from my paper and share it with you, because I want to use the exact wording if I can. Let's see. Okay, I found it. Sorry to keep you waiting. So this is about how the value relation raises as a relation between two commodities, and it assumes this like social things assume this like social relationship, whereas people relate to each other as things and so on. And there's a footnote which says, one man is king only because other men stand in relation of subjects to him. They, on the other hand, imagine that they're subjects because he's king. So this is very similar to, you know, how subjects are produced in historical and social relations, and what Foucault would say, you know, how the history of subjectification is also the history of subjection, and it's inseparable from it. And sort of like the value relationship concealed such practices and relationships. So in that sense, I find them similar in their approaches to relation, and I think it is kind of like a mode of intelligibility for both of them. So I mean, to sum it up, I think it puts things in motion and politicizes them, and it can sort of capture both like one-on-one relationships, but also larger kind of relationships.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer, and it sort of leads in to what I've been thinking as well. In part because it seems like the kind of work you're doing is, you know, the way that you're thinking about these things as not in terms of categorization or thinking about disability and animality as terms that are attached to particular bodies because of some essential quality within that body, but as apparatuses and things that are produced, relationally under systems like capitalism. There's also a lot of resonance, thinking back to how we started this meeting with an emphasis on decolonization, and Christian in particular with the territorial acknowledgement, and thinking about how systems of animalization and disabling systems sort of intersect with kind of global apparatuses of colonialism, that are produced or closely collude with capitalism, ableism, anthropocentrism, and so on. And so I'm thinking about these categories as sort of processual or negotiated relationally or constructed relationally, and also recalling the way that you've spoken to me in the past and today about capitalism as a kind of disabling system or a disabling power and a producer of disability. I'm coming back to that, the sort of global ramifications of, labor, when you borrow from Benenov's claim that, 40% of the global workforce is rendered superfluous under capitalism. And I think, you said as much as 60% of that population is disabled. I'm wondering about how this intersects with, broader questions of colonialism. And the way that I come at this question is through, the lens of debility, not to throw in another term here, but I know I've spoken with you about this term before, so I know you might be uniquely qualified to respond to it. And when I think about debility, I'm thinking in particular about how folks like Jasper Puar or Julie Livingston kind of frame this. I have a small quote from Puar where she says, "Debility foregrounds the slow wearing down of populations instead of the event of becoming disabled. And while the latter concept creates and hinges on a narrative of before and after for individuals who will eventually be identified as disabled, the former comprehends those bodies that are sustained in a perpetual state of debilitation, precisely through foreclosing the social, cultural, and political translation to disability," and of course arrives at the sort of situation of Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands and in the right to maim. And so I'm wondering, in thinking about your presentation and sort of Puar's work, but others as well who are responding to, especially when we think about, colonization where we are today, or I'm not assuming that we're all meeting from the same place, but I'm also on kind of colonized land. I'm wondering how, your model of disability intersects with notions of debility, how it responds to interlocking systems of colonialism and even kind of racialization, as well as a system that creates forms of disability or debility. And recognizing that your presentation is asking us to think about disability as as an apparatus, not something that's kind of an essential quality of bodies to whom it becomes attached, but recognizing, of course, that within a neoliberal society where kind of benefits are doled out unequally, adopting the label or category of disability has stakes attached to it, like very material stakes about whether you can access benefits and so on. There's a lot to consider here, but I guess broadly speaking, I'm asking you to speak a little bit more about the relationship between kind of other systems like colonialism, in relation to what you're raising as kind of disability, anthropocentrism, and even you said you wanted to speak more about impairment as well during the paper. So take that hodgepodge of questions if you have any responses.
Well, what I'm working on right now is actually to really look closely at that statement that we make very kind of hastily without thinking about it. When we say something like capitalism or oppressive system creates disability, what do we really mean? And that's what I'm working on right now, because I don't think, although we say it often enough, it seems very under-theorized, and it is connected to the definition of disability that has been sort of raised in the global north as this distinction between impairment and disability. And the idea is that, with the capitalism claim, the idea is that, in pre-capitalist societies, there was a different notion of labor and different kind of work, different rhythms, and maybe disabled people, impaired people existed, but they were integrated within their community. And so they weren't necessarily disabled, but this the industrial labor process and everything, excluded them from labor and excluded them thereby from society, because your value became attached to like your capacity to be absorbed by capitalist labor, and so on. But it seems like the more I look at it, it seems rather simplistic to only attach that to like your capacity, thinking of capacitation, your capacity to be, recruited by capital. And that can't really be the only thing. And I'm looking at debilitation. What Poir does is to sort of look at debilitation and capacitation as these moving poles. And the idea is that, it's not that you're like disabled or impaired, but that you can be debilitated in some ways, but capacitated in others. Like, middle-class white man disabled is capacitated in some ways, and he's, going to get all his welfare rights or whatever. So there's sort of like a push and pull in that side. And I find that very useful in terms of, I'm trying to put that in motion with the idea of proletarianization and surplusization, instead of the category of working class or the unit of class. Because what this definition of like how capitalism and disability are related has produced is that people are like, well, this is just another instance of disabled people becoming victims. We're excluded. Yeah, okay. Like, how is this useful? Because even if there was accommodation, not all of us are going to be able to work. So again, we're going to be excluded. So if you lock it onto like work and labor, then this relationship of disability and capitalism is sort of like left aside as like useless or, victimizing. On the other hand, if we don't look at it like class or work, but as proletarianization, which means that you are 100% market dependent for all your subsistence needs, and in order to get them, you need to work. It doesn't imply that you are able to work or able to, find work on a consistent basis, but you are proletarianized. A proletarian doesn't necessarily have work. And especially today with sort of like, there's more interest now in like surplus populations and superfluity and precarity because there's more of it. And so people have been looking at these things, and I think sort of, and so the other pole of proletarianization is when you can't find the work, but you have to, so you're compelled. So that's the sort of specificity of capitalism. It doesn't mean you're going to find it, ought doesn't imply can in this case, but you are proletarianized. So there's some great work done by trans philosophers. There's a book called Transgender Marxism, and there's a great article by Zoe Belinsky, who looks at disability as a problem of proletarianization, and how sort of like capitalism assumes that you appear in the marketplace to sell your labor fully capacitated. So they're like looking at reproductive labor, which is also kind of like who reproduces the workers to be capacitated at all. So, and they're using Poir's debilitation and capacitation and taking it further to sort of create this economic model of disability, which is really cool. It's a really great provocation. But in terms of Poir, I'm not exactly sure how debility is different from impairment, the more I look at it. And it seems like we need something like impairment. And on the other hand, when we politicize impairment, is it still impairment? Like, how are we to account for the negative, like when capitalism creates like work accidents or something like that, or environmental pollution, and it causes like sickness and disability. Maybe we need some kind of definition of impairment to capture that kind of injustice. But I want to go back to your question about other systems like colonialism and how they are also disablers, right? So there is a more recent call in disability studies to to construct a global South theory of disability. And one of the arguments is that, this impairment disability dichotomy doesn't work. There's more of like impairments in the global South, colonialism, neocolonialism, the intersecting histories of colonialism and capitalism create massive impairment. We have to think about impairment. We can't just put that aside. So that's one of their critiques of that sort of like ontological distinction. And another critique is that, of course, the global North model doesn't look at the experiences of people in the global South, but only looks at sort of like the history of capitalism or something like in the global North and in Europe and the US and so on, which is true. On the other hand, there's work done by like Nirmala Aravelis, who looks at how this history of disablement goes much further back than the advent of capitalism, and looks at how at the time of like colonialism and slavery, how race and in particular Blackness was already sort of structured as a form of disability in that like white imagination, but also there is like very literal impairment going on. So there's already that work going on. It already complicates this originary relationship between capitalism and disability. But on the other hand, in a theoretical sense, they're complementary because they're both saying this ex-oppressive exploitative system creates impairment and or disability and or debility. So they're making this claim. And also, the histories of colonialism and disability are also kind of intertwined. Colonialism makes disability possible in a way. So they sort of have a causal relationship as well. So in that sense, yes, I think these considerations, I'm trying to build something where I can address other systems as well. But at this point, I'm just trying to understand like how we're thinking about these things and why we keep making these like weird ontological commitments that then foreclose, asking better questions.
Thank you so much. And I think I'm out of time for my contribution. So I'm happy to open up to.
Go ahead, Jesse, please. I mean, it's, I think this is like, this is being a very, for me personally, a fascinating kind of back and forth. So, and we can go over time for like a few more minutes anyway, and like it's only 1:10. Okay. So we definitely have have more time for you to comment. So okay. If you want.
Thank you so much. That's really generous. But I'll invite anybody else, if you have questions or comments to contribute to the discussion, please do. I guess I want to think as well about the question of labor that undergirds your presentation from the kind of opening in thinking about the kind of symbolic work that animals and people with disabilities are tasked with doing, which is not the same thing as labor, obviously, but also kind of a thinking about theories of labor that apply to animality. And I think you do so in a really compelling way in thinking about animals that are rendered meat, that are whose lives are sort of erased in the process of making meat, and you cite folks like Dinesh Waddiwell, who has helped with that argument as well, even in the talk that they gave not long ago at Concordia. But I was thinking about thinking about the kind of intersections between anthropocentrism and disability, about the kinds of and again, I'm coming back to sort of animal studies and the sometimes celebratory discourses of companion species within it. This is a kind of longstanding critique for me, but thinking about domestication and, it as a producer of debility, impairment, or disability, and thinking especially about the sort of history or even maybe genealogy of animal breeding as something that produces forms of, and this is certainly obvious in the context of factory farming and abattoirs and forms of animal breeding that create disability within bodies that are identified as animal in order to make them more productive. for kind of the meat industry, but also thinking about forms of disability that are produced in the history of animal breeding, for example, dog breeding to produce desirable traits, where you have, I met a dog recently who, I don't know what the breed was specifically, but whose trachea kept coming dislodged, so kept having to cough to relodge its trachea, or, pugs or bulldogs that, continue to have breathing problems because of, the history of breeding there. And also, birthing as well, because of the size of the dog and how this kind of inflicts trauma on bulldogs who give birth. So I'm, in thinking about labor, I guess I'm thinking about the labor that domesticated animals or companion animals are tasked with, but also the histories and often unacknowledged kind of presences of disability that inflect relationships with animals that might otherwise appear kind of loving or idyllic, or ones that are so often I think celebrated amongst sort of animal advocates in various ways. And I'm wondering if the problems that you raise in your talk speak to practices of domestication as a form of disablement, or what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not really there yet, but I definitely want to look at domestication as a part of these histories. And now that I've only bracketed out, like, this is my work with Dinesh, we're looking at, how we can make this claim that, X system produces, impairments, disability, etc., especially capitalism, how we can make this claim, and looking at the concept of proletarianization. Now I'm bracketing out the animal studies aspect of it. And I often think, like, how am I gonna, if I construct something, how am I gonna connect this to animals? And I wondered if domestication in terms of animals is parallel to proletarianization, in the sense that you make animals dependent on you. You create them and sort of like you make them dependent on humans. So I'm not just thinking about like factory farming, but like actual like domestication and like companion animals and stuff. So, and I wondered if that was like a possible path. So this is like very nebulous, but that was one thing that I thought about. It's kind of like you task them with a certain kind of labor and a certain kind of living, and they depend on that in order to like survive for like their food and everything. So yeah, that's
sort of
one possible avenue. I don't know if I can connect them that way.
Yeah. I mean, it is sort of the way that sort of capitalism produces dependency, or even colonialism produces dependency, the forms of domestication as well are ones that, place, I guess, boundaries on bodies such that they become entirely dependent. And I think that, there's probably resonances with sort of feminist critiques of domestication as well, and the domestic, and the kind of violences that are inflicted on other than human lives as well, that are made into domesticated animals. Does anybody else have any other questions, I wonder?
Thank you so much for your questions.
Yeah, thank you for those really generous responses as well. I really appreciate it. And also the opportunity just to be in conversation again. It's been a while, so thanks so much.
Yeah, we're on the mute, so you can go ahead, Bengi.
I can, but my back is turned, so
you have.
Okay.
If that doesn't feel weird, because I can do that. Yes. Okay. This is you've never been here, but this is kind of because there's a big screen that I'm looking at right now, and there's this small screen, and it's like it's kind of being in a room with like many mirrors, and it's kind of, and it's like a glass kind of a glass room in the library, so it's very disoriented. Anyway, I want to first of all thank you, Balam and Jesse, for your contributions today, and I really enjoyed the talk. And I'm looking forward to reading more and seeing more about where this goes. So I am going to be, I am like as a self-identified Marxist feminist, political economist, I don't really have I really welcome this kind of complication in a way of processes of proletarianization, capital accumulation, production of social difference, and how that is kind of reproduced both materially and symbolically. So, but I want to ask like a kind of question for you to answer, but I want to point out one or two things that I think is kind of parallels more of the literatures that I'm embedded in or I'm more familiar with. The first one is I really appreciated and liked your emphasis. I have it in my notes, but and this was kind of from a quote about how capitalism creates the creativity of animals down to its metabolic and generative capacities of living organisms.
Dinesh Wells.
Yeah, and then kind of this almost paradoxical thing in that process about how reproduction of animals is both required for that particular kind of industrial capitalist kind of production, but it also is what this process itself is actually kind of erasing or eroding, and it kind of is like kind of hurting basically what it like the reproduction. And it very much kind of the one part of it is very much kind of echoing the eco-feminist kind of Marxists who are saying the reproduction of the conditions of production. Capitalism as a process hurts inherently the conditions of production. So it needs the conditions of production, including non-human nature, but human nature as well. So laborers and kind of the social and physical kind of conditions of production. But it also, capitalism is also because of, and also kind of some eco-socialist Marxists or eco-Marxists have also said this, right? Capitalism kind of inherently kind of hurts the conditions of its own reproduction. But then I think like what you quoted and adds another layer to it. So it's not only that it hurts the conditions of its own reproduction, but that conditions themselves become part of value creating service capital. So, and there is some political ecology work, kind of Marxist political ecology work, that kind of argues the same thing about those kind of ecological and social reproduction that before, in kind of other stages of capitalism, it was just that these conditions were outside of the market, outside of like value producing capital circuits. So they were just exploited and they were hurt or polluted, whatever. But now more and more what we're seeing, especially under neoliberalism, is that those conditions of production, social reproduction and ecological reproduction, are becoming commodities themselves. So they are being pulled into circuits of capital. So there is at least one kind of very kind of, I think, strong parallel between disability and animality studies that you're drawing on and this kind of, is a, I guess, like a social reproduction political economy, I guess.
Yeah.
That's my first point. So it was like a really kind of lighting up light bulbs in my head. The second one is I really like your emphasis on the proletarianization part. But I mean, I was wondering if there's any, and this came up more, I think, visibly in the exchange that you had with Jesse. By the way, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name correctly. Is it Jesse or Jess?
It's Jesse, yes.
Okay, perfect. So that like that, I guess, how like this concept of proletarianization captures the fact that just that laborers are separated, divorced from their means of social reproduction or production, does not mean that they're necessarily in like their labor power is exploited. They're not necessarily employed, right? But there's actually, I think, like again, a genealogy of Marxist work complicating the kind of the more orthodox Marxist interpretations of the notion of primitive accumulation and kind of looking at it as a contingent process contingent in the sense that the separation of laborers from their means of reproduction does not necessarily automatically entail their integration into circuits of accumulation. So that like the laborer or the wage laborer needs to be produced as a subject. And Jason Reed is the first name that comes to my mind that kind of looks at it as like as a historical and contingent process. So that was, and then there's like a kind of a New Left Review type of like argument from Michael Denning that like kind of says like the only bigger tragedy from like than being exploited is not being exploited, right? But like I think Jason Reed is like is a kind of a stronger kind of source of like reference that could support or like complement this concept and conceptualization.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think the social reproduction work you're referring to also complicates the notion of like this traditional understanding of labor already, because we're talking about, you know, reproduction, and it's sort of like set aside as if it's like this, you know, gifts of nature that's you know, Marx is talking about, but it's not a gift of nature. And like who reproduces the reproducers, you know?
Exactly. And there's like an entire then like a different equally fascinating debate about what is value and like is it only human labor that produces value, right?
Exactly.
And it kind of like connects to this to your broader project as well. So
exactly. Thank you for that. I was just thinking about the article that I mentioned by Zoe Belinsky from the Transgender Marxism book, because they are focusing on and they're sort of identifying the contradiction of capitalism as a crisis of reproduction. And they're sort of like making a connection between trans people and disabled people as people who have a particularly hard time reproducing themselves and sort of being capacitated to sort of like go on the market because we don't have these, you know, resources necessarily. But then I got to thinking, you know, who reproduces the reproducers? Because like, you know, somebody's going to reproduce you. There's going to be some sort of like network for whoever, you know, to be capacitated. But then who reproduces them? So I had this like
that's
I got into a vicious circle there. Like if we're gonna define one of the main contradictions as that, and I'm totally open to that, but I was kind of like, but then that also you know, assumes some kind of prior nature, or is that reproducer, like, is your mother already reproduced and capacitated by somebody else? Like, how does that work? It's kind of like when Marx is, you know, towards the end of Capital One, he's kind of like, well, you know, I talked about all these forms, but surplus value, it already presupposes capitalism. Everything I talked about presupposes capitalism. What do? We insert primitive accumulation. But it's actually like a construct, because otherwise it's just this square, like circle,
like completely self-referential. But I mean, I think like there's actually like who reproduces the reproducers, and how do some of the dynamics that we talk about in terms of capitalism or production of commodities, do we see the same things play out in the reproduction of reproducers? And I think like in different ways, this is being taken up when people talk about the care crisis. They're like partly talking about the exhaustion, and I think like in a way like the care workers, the healthcare workers, the educational kind of the workers of the education sector, and as well as kind of workers, social reproductive workers who are not paid, like who are doing kind of unpaid and kind of community household based kind of work. But who reproduces the reproducers is also kind of the question I feel like Silvia Federici is like taking up. She's talking about Calvin and the Witch, like, because she's kind of doing what Marx is doing in terms of primitive accumulation, like who decided to reproduce, like, or was it a decision, or like were they kind of compelled to reproduce, and kind of draws a parallel and like kind of produces that very much needed complement to primitive accumulation by saying, hey, women were put in this position because their control over their bodies and all of their kind of non-household based activities were repressed or kind of or made impossible. So I think this is like I'm really excited to see where this is all going, and I'm really, I mean, I just a personal thank you for the fascinating call.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to turn my back again.
Turn your back. Oh, thank you all so much.
So I have a lot of questions, as you might expect.
Christiane and I are working on very similar.
But I will invite you to dinner to my place for all my questions. Also, I wanted to let people know that Balam is also giving a talk at the GREA on, I just forgot the date. I just looked at it. You can look at that on our website, on the Social Justice Center website.
Maybe tell what GREA is.
GREA, sorry, the groupe de recherche en éthique animale et environnementale. Ça va être d'environ une semaine. It will be in about a week and a half. And can you just remind us quickly what you will be talking about at this talk?
Well, I'll actually be talking more about Shukin's work, and like what I got to towards the end of this talk, I'm going to be expanding on that. That's the paper I wrote for you, Jesse, a while ago. I'm still milking you. No, like there's so much in Shukin's work that's really great. So I'm sort of looking at surplus populations and the rendering industry together. But I'm like expanding on, you know, Marxist, you know, idea of surplus populations, where disability is found in them, and so on and so forth. And so I'm explaining further. It's kind of like a continuation of this talk. So like what I got to at the end of this talk, I talk it right at length at the GREA presentation.
Will that talk be available on Zoom as well?
Yes.
Okay, I'll
You're
sign
gonna
up. Absolutely, I'm excited.
Yay. And now I'm losing my voice too. Like,
So thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone. I think we will conclude that. Do you have any last comments?
No, I don't. I just want to thank, I mean, I think we lost like a bunch of people who were actually at the talk and on Zoom towards the end, but I wanted to thank both of you again, and Nicholas, who's been your kind of systematic audience next to us, and we will have another one of these seminars next week at noon. Leah will be talking about mapping and the effect of indigenous land, so mapping methods and how they can be used like in alliance with indigenous struggles for stolen land. So we hope to see you there too, and enjoy the very, very warm weather and the weekend.
thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Lovely to see you all.
Great.
Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
I hope you will feel better, Balam.
Yeah.
I'm starting to go like that was my last. I'm gonna go collapse in my bed, which is right here.
I mean, take care of yourself, and I hope you feel better.
I hope to see you next week.
Yes, I'll be there next week.
I have lots of questions about different type of speciesism, about useless animals and stuff like that.
I'll be
See you
there.
soon.
I'll be there. You can
Okay.
interrogate me as much as you want.
I'll when I invite you to dinner, I have 2 people working on ableism and animality too that I will invite. So I guess you will have a lot in common with those people. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. See you
Bye.
next week. Bye bye.